I always thought I knew my wife. We had been together for 7 years, and it seemed to me that we had gone through every possible difficulty. But in the last few months, something changed. Laura began to stay late at work more often. Business trips, meetings, corporate events, she seemed to be working harder than ever. I didn't ask too many questions. I trusted her. Until one evening my friend Tom sent me a message. "Nick, I saw Laura outside her apartment on Grove Avenue today. If that's not her double, I'm shocked." I read it 3 times. Grove Avenue? We never knew anyone there. At first I thought Tom was mistaken. But curiosity won out. I went to the classified site and found an apartment at that address. It was listed as a private massage parlor, with appointments by appointment only. I signed up for an evening class. When I arrived, the receptionist met me and asked me to wait. The door opened and I saw Laura. She froze, looking at me as if she had seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" I took out a folder with divorce papers from my inside pocket and put them on the table. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Laura silently took the documents without even trying to say anything. I did not wait for an explanation. I turned around and walked out while she stood in the middle of the room, clutching our joint end in her hands. The next few days were quiet. Laura did not come home that night. I didn't expect her to. I woke up in the morning and found her keys on the kitchen table. There was no note, no message. Just the keys and a feeling of emptiness in the house. I didn't call or write. I just started putting her things away. I opened the closet and slowly started putting her clothes in boxes. Her favorite sweater, the one she was always stealing from my shelf, went there too. All day I silently collected everything that reminded me of her. Max, our dog, nervously walked around the room, sniffing the boxes. He didn't understand where Laura had gone either. By the evening, I had left only what belonged to me. The next day I went to a lawyer to officially file the documents. Tom came to me in the evening with a bottle of whiskey. "How are you?" I poured him a glass and answered briefly. "I'm doing fine." He didn't ask any questions. We sat on the terrace, smoked cigars that I had kept for a special occasion, and were silent. "You did the right thing, Nick," Tom finally said. I just nodded. A week later, Laura called. "We need to talk." "It's not necessary anymore." She exhaled into the phone, and I heard her footsteps in the background. "I know this is not an excuse, but..." "But what?" I interrupted abruptly. But was it a moment of weakness? She fell silent. "Laura, let's end this with dignity. I don't want to hear any more explanations." "Okay," she said quietly. That was our last conversation. A month later, I received official confirmation of the divorce. I took off her wedding ring and put it in the same box where her things were. Max lay down next to her, as if guarding something important. I sat down on the couch, hugged him, and realized that it was the most peaceful evening I'd had in years. A few weeks later, I finally started to get used to the silence in the house. Max stopped running to the door whenever someone passed by and no longer looked out the window for Laura. One day, while cleaning the garage, I found an old box of photo albums. It was on the top shelf, gathering dust. I opened it, expecting to feel some pain or regret, but instead there was only indifference. Photos from vacations, evenings with friends, our wedding. I pulled out one of them. We were sitting on the beach, Laura was laughing, and I was holding her shoulders. It seemed so far away, like it wasn't me. I put the album back and closed the box. "Enough of the past," I said to Max, who was sitting at the entrance to the garage, watching me. He barked as if he agreed. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. In the evening, I decided to walk to a bar nearby. It was crowded, but in a nice, calm way. I sat down at the bar and ordered a whiskey. "You haven't been here for a long time," said a familiar bartender named Lucas. I was dealing with my personal life. Lucas nodded and put the glass in front of me. "Well, congratulations on your return to life." I raised my glass and nodded briefly. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. Closer to midnight, when I was about to leave, someone touched me on the shoulder. "Nick?" I turned around. Kate was standing in front of me. We hadn't seen each other for a long time, since college. "Kate, you were in New York." She was. But she returned a few months ago. We sat down at the table, reminiscing about old times, laughing about our student adventures. Kate talked about her work, I talked about Max and the house, which now seemed too big for me alone. "You're holding up well," she said after her third whiskey. "It all passes," I answered, looking at the ice in the glass. Kate held her gaze a little longer than necessary and then said, "If you want company for a walk or coffee, let me know." I smiled. "It sounds like a plan." We exchanged numbers, and when I walked home, I had a feeling that this evening was the beginning of something new. Max met me at the door, his tail wagging. "We have a new plan now, buddy," I said, throwing my jacket on the rack. Max just barked and followed me into the living room. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to move on. The next morning I woke up with a slight headache from the whiskey, but my mood was better than usual. Max, as always, was sitting by the bedside, looking at me with anticipation. Okay, I muttered, getting up, "let's go for a walk." It was a cold but sunny morning. We were walking along the park, and I found myself thinking about last night. About Kate. She was always the girl with whom I felt easy, but life somehow took us in different directions. And now, years later, we have met again. Max was running in the snow, leaving footprints behind him. I took out my phone and opened her contact. My fingers hovered over the screen for a few seconds. "Let me know if you want to go for a walk," her voice said in my head. I sighed and wrote, "Morning walk with the dog. If you're still in town, join us, ****. The message went out, and I moved on. Max ran over, shook the snow off his paws, and sat down, staring ahead. I looked in that direction and saw Kate. She was standing outside the coffee shop, waving at me. "Are you serious?" I muttered, looking at Max. He just barked and ran to her as if it was part of his plan. "Hi," Kate said as I came closer, "I thought you could use some coffee." "Are you a mind reader?" "No, I've just known you for a long time." We walked on together. Max ran cheerfully ahead of me, and I caught the moments when Kate laughed at his antics. "I'm glad you're back in shape," she said when we reached the end of the park. "I'm doing fine." She stopped and looked at me a little more seriously. "I also went through a difficult period. But do you know what helped?" "What?" "People are close by. And time." I nodded. "I definitely have time. And the people, well, Max is still in the lead." Kate laughed and put her hand on my shoulder. "Let me add myself to this list." I looked at her and smiled. Added. We walked for a long time that morning, and I realized that there was no need to rush. Everything happens at the right time. Max ran up to us, and I knew he definitely approved of this move. The next few weeks passed unnoticed. Kate and I started seeing each other more often, spontaneous walks, morning coffee, evenings in the park with Max. She fit into my life so easily, as if she had always been a part of it. One evening, when we were sitting on the terrace drinking wine, Kate, wrapped in my sweater, said, "Do you notice how your life has changed over the past months?" I looked at her and thought that indeed, not so long ago I was sitting in this same chair, not knowing how to move on. I notice it. But I don't think it happened by itself. She raised an eyebrow. And who contributed to this? I looked at Max, who was lying at her feet, and smiled. I think this guy has something to do with it. Max raised his head when he heard his name and wagged his tail. Kate laughed. Well, to be honest, he is a good psychologist. But I think your role here is not insignificant either. We silently watched the sunset while Max lazily dozed next to us. To be honest, I thought it would be harder after everything. Kate looked at me curiously. You mean Laura? I nodded. To be honest, sometimes I think about her. But not with anger. Just as something that has happened and is over. Kate squeezed my hand. This is a good thing. This is usually the way it should be. What about you? She took a sip of wine and sighed. My ex-husband is long gone. And I realized that I was no longer holding on to what had happened. I looked at her and saw in her eyes the same thing I felt, lightness and readiness to move on. I think we are on the right track, I said. I think we are already there. Max lifted his head and laid down closer to us, as if he wanted to be a part of this conversation as well. Kate laughed and hugged him. Perhaps he is our official witness on this path. And the main member of the family. She looked at me with a warm smile. Who said I was against it? We stayed on the terrace until late at night, listening to the wind rustle the leaves. Now this house was warm. Not from the fireplace or blankets, but from those who had become part of it. A few days later, Kate brought a box of cookies and a bottle of wine. Is this a holiday set? I asked, meeting her on the doorstep. Spring is coming soon. It's time for renewal, she said as she went inside and took off her shoes. Max immediately ran up to her, wagging his tail happily, as if we hadn't seen each other for a week, even though Kate had been here yesterday. By the way, I brought something for him, too. She pulled out a new toy in the form of a large rubber bone from her bag. Max jumped, snatched it out of her hands and immediately carried it to the corner, protecting his prey. Now he's busy for a few hours, I laughed, inviting Kate into the kitchen. She put the box of cookies on the table and began to put them on plates. Listen, she said, a little nervously, I was thinking, what if we went away for the weekend? I looked up, slightly surprised. Vacation? Well, not really. Just a change of scenery. We could go to the mountains or the lake for a few days. Max will come with us, Rocky, if he wants to, she smiled, looking at Rocky, who was lazily dozing by the fireplace. I thought about it. It's a good idea. We haven't been out for a long time. Kate was excited and immediately started scrolling through her phone in search of a place to rest. How about a house by the lake? My friends have a great dacha, and they rent it out sometimes. It sounds perfect. It's a deal. I'll book tomorrow. Max ran up to us again, as if he realized that something was being planned. He put his toy down at my feet and looked into my eyes hopefully. Good, good, you're coming with us, I said, stroking his head. Kate laughed. He seems to be in anticipation of adventure. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. A few days later, we were driving in the car, Max was sitting in the back seat, and Rocky was napping next to him. Kate was playing the radio and I was driving, enjoying the road and her company. When we got to the house by the lake, snow still covered the ground, but the air already smelled like spring. Max immediately jumped out of the car and started running around the yard, while Rocky slowly explored the new territory. Kate stood next to him, wrapped in a scarf, looking at the lake glistening in the sun. It's beautiful here, she said, intertwining her fingers with mine. I looked at her and smiled. This is what we need. Max barked loudly from across the yard, as if in agreement. Rocky just watched him in silence, with the same patience as always. This vacation was a new beginning for us. And I knew that there would be many more moments like this. On the first evening by the lake, Kate and I sat on the veranda, wrapped in blankets, glasses of wine in hand. Max was running around the yard, grabbing the snowballs I threw him or dragging the branches he found to the porch. Rocky, as always, sat nearby, watching him closely, as if he were a guardian of peace. "He never gets tired," Kate said, laughing. "He always has more energy than the two of us combined." Kate turned to me, her gaze lingering a little longer than usual. "And this is good. I think I used to be afraid of such changes." I leaned closer, feeling the warmth of her palm in my hand. "And now?" Kate took a sip of wine and leaned against me. "Now I feel that change is the right thing to do. They bring us to where we need to be." I hugged her shoulders, letting these words sink in. Max ran up to the veranda and threw himself into Kate's arms, putting his head in her lap. "Oh, you want to be part of this philosophical conversation, too?" she laughed, stroking his ear. Rocky slowly walked over and laid down next to me, as if he realized that this moment was important. We sat there while the setting sun reflected on the lake. ####. The next morning we went for a walk along the shore. The lake was calm, covered with light ice. Max ran ahead, occasionally looking back as if to check if we were keeping up. "I would never have thought that a trip for a few days could have such an impact on my mood," Kate said, watching the birds in the branches. "Sometimes we just need a change of scenery." I stopped, watching Max play by the water. Kate came closer, ran her hand down my back, and whispered, "Perhaps we could do this more often." I turned to her, looked into her eyes and smiled. "Are you saying that trips with Max and Rocky can become our new tradition?" "Why not?" Max ran over, shaking the water off his fur right at us. "Well, he definitely supports this idea," I laughed, wiping the drops from my face. Kate leaned over and hugged Max. "I think he already has a plan for all our future trips." Rocky slowly walked over and sat down next to him, with the same calm expression on his face, as if agreeing with everything that was happening. We moved on, leaving our footprints in the thin layer of snow, and I realized that these moments are the best things in life. There was something real about it. And it seemed to be the beginning of a new chapter that I had been looking for a long time. That evening, when we returned to the house, the snow began to fall thicker. Max was hanging around the door again, and Rocky just laid down by the fireplace, lazily watching everything that was happening. Kate stoked the fireplace, and the room quickly filled with the warmth and smell of wood. We sat down on the couch, covered with a single blanket, and Max snuggled up at our feet, as if he was also looking for comfort. "Do you remember the last time we sat by the fireplace like this?" Kate asked, leaning her head on my shoulder. "It was back in college. We were hanging out in your student house because the snow had covered the whole neighborhood." Kate laughed. "And you almost burned your coat when you tried to dry it over the fire. I am still convinced that it caught fire on its own." She raised her head and looked at me with a smile. "So you're saying that the fireplace was to blame?" "Definitely." Max looked up when he heard us laughing and put his head back down. Rocky didn't even move, as if he knew that this story would not end with anything important. Kate took my hand and said quietly, "I'm glad we found this house. It's really nice here." I looked at her and gently squeezed her hand. "This is the best decision we have made recently." She sat comfortably on the couch and closed her eyes. "Let's not rush home tomorrow." I ran my hand through her hair. "We are in no hurry." ####. The next morning was quiet. When I woke up, Kate was still asleep, and Max was sitting by the door, looking out into the snowy yard. Rocky, as usual, was lying in the corner by the fireplace, feeling like he was in control. I went out onto the terrace, breathing in the fresh frosty air. The forest was covered with snow, and the lake behind the house was barely visible through the trees. Max jumped out after me and started jumping into the snow, chasing invisible enemies. Kate followed, wrapped in a blanket, and sat down next to him. "It's the best morning I've had in a long time," she said, watching Max run around the yard. "And it is just beginning." She leaned closer and whispered, "How about another cup of coffee? I am on my way." When I came back from the kitchen with 2 cups, Kate was standing by the terrace, looking out at the lake. I came closer and hugged her, handing her a cup of hot coffee. "It's nice here. Maybe we could come back here every year." Kate smiled. "You read my mind." Max ran up and jumped onto the terrace with us, sprinkling snow on our feet. "Well, it seems that someone has already made this decision for us." We stayed on the terrace, watching the snowfall slowly stop. It was real happiness, simple and quiet, without unnecessary words. That evening the snow stopped and the sky cleared, revealing stars shining brightly over the lake. Max, tired of endlessly playing in the snow, lay down by the fireplace and snored softly, occasionally twitching his paws in his sleep. Rocky, as always, chose a place near the door, as if to protect us from all possible threats from the outside world. Kate was sitting on the floor by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, drinking hot tea, staring at the fire. "Don't you think there's something magical about it?" she said, not taking her eyes off the flames. "Fire or the house itself?" Kate smiled slightly. "Both of them. But more than that, we are here with you." I sat down next to her, hugged her shoulders and kissed her temple. And who would have thought that a simple trip to the lake would become something more? She leaned closer, touching her head to mine. "Maybe this is a sign that we need more moments like this. More escapes from the city." Kate looked up and looked at me seriously. "More time for us." I didn't know what to say, so I just kissed her, letting her know that I heard every word. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. The next morning we decided to stay another day. Max ran outside right after breakfast and started digging through the snow as if he was looking for something extremely important. What did he find there? Kate wondered, looking at him from the window. I laughed. He is just a dog. He doesn't need a reason to dig up half a yard. Rocky stood nearby, watching Max's every move. Rocky looks like he's thinking, what is this kid doing? He always looks like that. An experienced teacher. Kate turned to me, leaning on the windowsill. How do you look at me? I put my coffee cup on the table and came closer. As for the person who became my new beginning. She held her gaze on me for a moment and then said quietly. It is mutual. Meanwhile, Max burst into the house with another branch in his teeth, leaving traces of snow all over the floor. Here comes our agent of chaos, Kate smiled, wiping Max's paws. I hugged her from behind, watching her worry about him. The next evening, when we were sitting on the terrace with glasses of red wine, Kate looked at me the way you look when you want to say something but don't know where to start. Nick, have you ever thought about leaving the city for good? I put the glass on the railing and looked at her carefully. What do you mean? Kate shrugged her shoulders, sipping the wine in small gulps. We are always running somewhere. Work, meetings, traffic jams. And here everything is so simple. Maybe it's time to think about something new. I remained silent, listening to Max digging in the snow under the terrace, while Rocky watched him from above, like a wise mentor. Are you offering to buy a house in the country? Kate nodded. We could find something cozy like this house. Going out to the porch in the morning with coffee, walking with Max and Rocky by the lake. I thought about it. The idea didn't seem so crazy after all. And what are we going to do with the work? Kate smiled. We can work remotely. It's not a problem now. I turned my gaze to the lake, where the snow glistened in the sunset. Do you think Max will cope with life in the country? If he can survive another week without demolishing half of this building, then yes. We both laughed. Then let's see what options are available. Kate raised an eyebrow in surprise. Are you serious? Absolutely. If this is what will make us happy, why not? Kate put down her glass and hugged me tightly, burying her face in my neck. Thank you, Nick. Max ran up when he heard our voices and started jumping around us, not understanding why everyone was so happy. And thank you, boy, I said, bending down to pet him. Rocky just wagged his tail lazily, making it clear that he was the wisest in the story. This evening is etched in my memory as the moment when I realized that a new stage begins right here, in the simplicity of these days, next to those who have become my family. A few weeks later we returned to the city, but something in the air felt different. The house seemed smaller, the streets noisier, and the pace of life too fast. Max would sit by the door all day long, looking out at the yard, as if he was waiting for us to go back to that house by the lake. Rocky was calm, but I noticed that he liked to lie on the terrace more than in our cramped living room. Kate has changed too. I've seen her surfing real estate websites after work, scrolling through photos of houses in the woods or near water. One evening she was sitting at her laptop when I came out of the shower. Anything interesting? She looked up and smiled. There are several houses not far from where we were. Do you want to see them? I sat down next to him, wiping my hair with a towel. Why not? Kate opened one of the ads, a small two-story house with large windows and a terrace that overlooked the lake. It's definitely not in the city, I joked, looking at the photo. But this is what we need. I ran my fingers over her hand. Schedule a viewing. Let's watch it live. Kate turned her head and looked at me for a long time, as if trying to make sure I was serious. Are you really ready for this step? I'm ready for anything if it's next to you. She kissed me lightly and said quietly. I'll call the agent tomorrow. Hashtag. The next day we went to the lake again. Max was nervous in the car, whining and constantly sticking his head between the seats. Rocky, on the other hand, was dozing peacefully, opening his eyes from time to time to check where we were going. The house turned out to be even better than in the photo. Fresh air, the smell of pine needles, silence. Max immediately began to run around the yard, and Rocky came out and lay down on the porch, as if he already saw himself as the owner. Kate stood next to me, holding my hand. What do you think? I looked at her and at the house, which stood quietly among the trees. It's good here. Shall we sign? I nodded. We sign it. It was our new beginning, not in search of something better, but in creating a place where we could be happy together. A month later, we were already packing. Cardboard boxes filled the living room, and Max was happy to jump between them, pulling out things I had just put away. Rocky was in the corner, watching with a bit of skepticism. Max, this isn't helping, I muttered, pulling a roll of packing tape from his mouth. Kate walked into the room with another stack of boxes and stopped at the threshold, watching the scene. I see that you are very productive here. I try, but some of the assistants are not very helpful, I answered, nodding at Max. She laughed, put the boxes on the floor, and came closer. Well, if you can't handle it, give him something easier. For example? Kate sat down next to Max, hugged him, and whispered. You are in charge of the toy box. Max barked and ran to his things. You see, Kate said, the main thing is to find an approach. I laughed and continued to pack the books. Hashtag. The moving day was chaotic. The truck was waiting at the driveway, and Kate and I carried the boxes while Max ran around making sure none of them were left without his attention. Rocky, as usual, lazily watched the whole process until his bed was loaded into the car. Only then did he slowly sit down by the door, showing that he was ready to go. So, is everyone here? Kate asked as she closed the car. Everyone except Max. He tries to catch the box again. Max pulled another one out of the living room, leaving a long paw print on the floor. Okay, I sighed, this is his trophy now. Kate took my hand and we looked around the empty apartment one last time. Do you have any regrets? She asked quietly. Not a single second. We went outside, locked the door, and drove to meet our new life in the countryside. ####. When we arrived, Max immediately rushed to explore the new yard. Rocky walked out slowly, as if assessing the area, and lay down on the terrace overlooking the lake. Kate stood next to him, watching the evening sun sink over the water. It will be fine here, she said, squeezing my hand. I hugged her shoulders, breathing in the fresh air. It will be a home. Max ran up to us with a large branch in his teeth, ready for new adventures. Rocky just sighed and closed his eyes, accepting the new stage as calmly as he does everything in this life. We spent the evening of that day on the terrace, sitting on old wooden chairs that I had collected before we moved. Max lay down at our feet, still holding the same branch in his teeth as if it were a symbol of his personal victory. Rocky, as always, sat a little further away, calmly watching the lake. It's the first night in our new home, Kate said, holding a glass of wine. I ran my fingers over her hand. And definitely not the last. She smiled and leaned toward me, touching my shoulder. Do you think Max will ever get tired? Only if the world runs out of branches. We laughed, and Max raised his head as if he realized that the conversation was about him. I wonder how he will welcome guests. If someone comes to the door, he will definitely scare them with his energy, I said, patting him on the back. Kate took a sip of wine and looked at the house, which still smelled of fresh paint. You know, it feels like we're starting all over again. I nodded. Sometimes you need to take a step back to find the right path. She hugged my hand, and we watched in silence as the sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon. Max fell asleep against my leg, and Rocky sighed peacefully, as if he had finally realized that this was their new home. This silence that enveloped us was not just peace, it was a feeling that you were where you were supposed to be. And with every breath of cold air, I realized that the future begins with such evenings, where there is nothing superfluous. It was just us, our home, and this endless landscape unfolding before us. The next morning I was woken up by a light tapping on the window. The melting snow was tapping on the glass, and the dawn was breaking outside, painting the sky pink. Kate was still sleeping, softly sobbing under the warm blanket. Max, as usual, was already sitting by the door, tail wagging, ready for the new day. I got up, opened the door, and let him out into the yard. Max immediately ran to the lake, leaving tracks in the thin layer of snow that covered the ground. Rocky came out more slowly, stretching and looking around with indifference. Ready for another day in paradise? I asked Rocky as he laid down on the terrace with no plans for activity. He just wagged his tail lazily. I made myself some coffee and went out on the porch. The air was fresh, and everything around me breathed peace. Kate joined me later, wrapped in a blanket. She hugged me from behind and put her head on my shoulder. You got up early. Max left me no choice. We looked at him together. He was running around the yard, chasing imaginary enemies. Do you think he will ever get tired? Maybe when he's as old as Rocky. Kate laughed, leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. It looks like we have many active years ahead of us. I nodded, watching our yard and the lake shimmering calmly in the morning sun. But I don't mind. Kate sat down next to me and we silently enjoyed the morning, allowing ourselves to just be here and now. Sometimes happiness is not about big events or achievements. It's a morning on the porch with your loved one, dogs running around, and the feeling of being at home. This was the whole point of our new life. The following days passed in a calm rhythm, as if we had always lived here. Max became the real master of the yard, running from the terrace to the lake, checking every bush and leaving tracks wherever he could. Rocky, on the other hand, behaved like a true patriarch. He walked leisurely, sometimes just sat at the gate and watched Max, like a mentor who knows that youth must go its own way. One day, on my way back from the local store, I stopped at the edge of the road overlooking our house. The snow had already begun to melt, and the first green sprouts were poking through the ground. A thin stream of smoke was coming out of the chimney, and Max was running around the yard, playing with a branch that he had apparently pulled out of some hedge again. Kate was standing on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, waving at me when she spotted the car. Everything looked so natural, as if this was where we were supposed to be all along. "Did something happen?" Kate asked when I stopped and just looked at the house without getting out of the car. I got out, walked around the car, and hugged her right there on the porch. "Nothing. I was just thinking how good it was to be here." Kate smiled, putting her head on my shoulder. "I think about it every morning too." Max ran up to us, shaking off the remnants of snow from his paws, and Rocky slowly came and sat next to us, as if it were another family ritual. "I think," Kate said, "that we should plant some trees in the backyard. It will be the first thing we do together in this house. Won't Max tear them out?" She laughed. "He can't eat all the trees. I wouldn't be so sure if I saw him tearing down everything." Kate looked up and looked at me seriously. "But we will plant it anyway." "Of course. ####. The next weekend we went to the garden center and brought back some young trees. Max actively helped by running around each hole we dug, and Rocky just laid in the sun and watched the performance. "In a few years," Kate said, wiping the soil from her palms, "it will be a real garden." I looked at her, smiling slightly. "In a few years, I'm sure we won't remember what it was like here without these trees." She took my hand, and we stood in the middle of the yard, looking at the saplings that would become part of our history. And perhaps it was the best symbol of our new life, something that would grow with us. Spring came unnoticed. The snow had melted, leaving behind wet ground that was quickly covered with young grass. Max ran around the yard, enjoying every ray of sunshine, and Rocky, as always, watched from the terrace, letting the young boy expend energy for them both. The trees we planted have sprouted their first buds. Kate went out to the yard almost every morning with a cup of coffee and checked on them as if they were her own personal project. One morning, when I was unloading firewood for the fireplace, Kate came up to me holding a phone. "You won't believe it." I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked at her. "What happened?" She raised an eyebrow and handed me the screen. "Our old house was sold." I looked at the photo on the real estate agency's website. It was our old house in the city, but with a different interior. New people, new lives. "It's strange to see him like this," I said, handing her the phone back. Do you know what I felt? I looked at her with interest. "Nothing." Kate smiled and hugged me around the neck. "This house doesn't matter anymore. Everything that was important is already here." I hugged her, breathing in the smell of spring air coming from the lake. "And I think the same way." ####. Next week we decided to invite guests to a housewarming party. Kate spent several days thinking about the menu, and I was busy setting up the backyard, installing lanterns and benches around the fire pit. When the day came, our yard was filled with the laughter of friends and acquaintances. Max was running around demanding attention, and Rocky was peacefully napping in the shade of the tree that was destined to grow with this house. Tom, my best friend, was sitting by the fire with a glass of whiskey, watching it all. "It looks good on you, Nick," he said, raising his glass. "What exactly?" Tom smiled. "Calmness. For the first time in a long time, you really look happy." I looked over at Kate, who was standing by the table with her friends, laughing and pouring wine into glasses. "Because I am happy." Max ran up to us with another branch, which he seemed to have pulled out from under a young tree again. "Hey, don't touch the garden," Tom joked, pulling the branch back. Kate came over and sat down next to me. Are you dividing the territory? We are trying to save the tree from this hooligan. She leaned over to Max and whispered. This is your yard, Max. They don't understand anything. We all laughed. This evening was everything I had imagined. Simple and warm. And I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The next morning, the yard was still littered with traces of last night's party, the remains of firewood by the fire pit, empty glasses on the terrace, and Max sleeping peacefully in the middle of all this chaos, hugging the same branch he had wrestled from Tom. Kate came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and sat down next to me on the stairs. It looks like a hurricane has passed through here. But it was a good hurricane. She smiled and handed me a cup. Do you think our friend survived yesterday? I think Tom is still sleeping in the car by the lake. Kate laughed and added quietly. Maybe. We sat in silence, watching the sun slowly rise over the treetops. Rocky came out of the house and lay down next to him, watching Max, who finally woke up and started dragging his branch around the yard again. He never gets tired, does he? Kate said, watching Max run happily through the grass. I think this is his superpower. Kate put her head on my shoulder and whispered. I am glad we did it. What exactly? All this step. A house, a move, a new life. I kissed her lightly in the hair. Me neither. Meanwhile, Max brought his branch right to our feet and looked at us hopefully. Okay, boy, I said, picking her up, just for a little while. I threw a branch far out into the field, and Max instantly took off running after it. Kate laughed. This will be our new ritual. A perfect start to the morning. Rocky seemed to think otherwise. He yawned, stretched, and went back inside, leaving us to watch Max play. Listen, Kate said, snuggling closer, maybe this summer we'll finally try to buy a boat? I raised an eyebrow. A boat? Yes, to go out on the lake in the evenings. Should I take Max with me? Kate thought for a second. Well, maybe he'll have to stay on the beach with Rocky. I think it's a good idea. We sat there while the sun rose higher, and I realized that life here has its own simple magic. This place became home for us, not because of the house or the lake, but because of the moments we created together. And I was sure that there were many more mornings like this to come, with Max, Rocky, and the 2 of us on the terrace, watching the day begin again. Summer came quickly, and with the first warm days, the yard turned into a living space for all of us. Max hardly ever came inside the house anymore, always running between the trees or swimming in the lake. Rocky, as always, chose the role of a watchdog, lying quietly in the shadows, keeping everything under control with wise indifference. One morning, I went out on the terrace with a cup of coffee and saw Kate standing at the water's edge, barefoot, with her jeans rolled up, throwing stones into the water. What are you doing there? I asked, going down to her. She turned around with that smile that always meant she was on to something. I think it's time to buy a boat. I sat down next to him and looked at the lake. Are you serious? Absolutely. Imagine, evenings on the water, fishing, silence. I laughed. Silence with Max on board? Kate sighed and sat down next to him. Well, maybe he'll stay on the beach with Rocky. We looked at the lake in silence. If the boat is part of our new life, let's look for it, I said, hugging her shoulders. Really? True. Kate turned to me. You know that this is all a new stage, right? I looked at Max, who at that moment flew out of the water and started running on the grass, spraying everyone around. Yes, and I like it. ####. A week later, we were standing at the pier, where the owner of the boat was showing us how to operate a small motor. Max, who was tied to a pole, loudly protested that he was not being taken along. Relax, I told him, this is a test drive. Kate got behind the wheel and laughed as the engine roared to life. Do they trust us with this? I think they will regret it. We went out on the water, leaving Max on the shore with Rocky. Max ran along the lake, accompanying us from the shore, and Rocky, as usual, just lay down in the grass and watched us go. ####. On my way home that evening, I stopped the car outside the house and just looked at it for a minute. You know, I told Kate, sometimes it seems like we've been going for this for so long. She put her hand on mine and answered quietly. And finally they came. Max jumped out of the car and immediately ran to the water. Rocky slowly followed, again choosing the shade under the tree. As the sun began to set, Kate and I sat on the terrace and watched Max play on the beach. This stage of life was not about noise or achievements. It was about the silence that fills the house when you know you are finally in your place. Summer was gaining momentum, and our evenings on the lake became a tradition. The boat, which we named Marine Max, was parked at a small marina, and every time we went out, Max stayed on the shore, whining in displeasure, until Rocky laid down next to him as if to say, "Calm down, they'll be back." One evening, when the sun was already hiding behind the horizon, Kate was driving the boat, and I was standing on the bow, watching the lake surface reflect the last light of the day. "Did you ever think we would live like this?" she asked, keeping her hands on the steering wheel. I turned to her and smiled. "Never. But now I can't imagine it any other way." She turned off the motor, and the boat quietly stopped in the middle of the lake. "It's so quiet here," Kate said, looking into the distance. I sat down next to her, and we silently enjoyed this moment. "Do you think it will last?" she whispered, putting her head on my shoulder. "Why not? We have everything we need." Kate raised her head and looked me in the eye. "And I'm not against this life." Max barked on the shore, breaking the silence. We both laughed. "It seems he reminded us that we can't stay here forever," Kate said as she started the engine. "Another 10 minutes. Let him get nervous." ####. The next day, Kate and I decided to set up the backyard, put a hammock between the trees, add some lights and make a small garden. Max, as usual, turned into the main decorator and destroyed several lavender bushes that Kate had barely had time to plant. "Nick, that's the third bush today," she stood with her hands on her hips, watching Max run around with a branch in his teeth. "Well, he wants to leave his mark on landscape design, too," I answered, not trying to hold back my laughter. Kate looked up to the sky and sighed. "So be it. But if he touches the roses, you'll both spend the night in the garage." Rocky watched this chaos from the terrace, looking like he was thinking, "I told you this was a bad idea." ####. Those summer evenings became a part of our lives, a fire, the smell of pine trees and fresh air that brought a sense of peace. Kate often liked to sit on the terrace with a cup of tea and watch the dusk cover the lake. "We're not looking anymore, are we?" she once said, looking at the water. I sat down next to her and hugged her. "We have already found everything we need." Max was lying at our feet, breathing heavily after another run, and Rocky was sleeping a little further away, under a tree, as always choosing the place with the best view. That was the point. The simplicity of moments that seem ordinary, but they are what fills life. The next morning I woke up to Max whimpering softly at the door. The sun was just beginning to rise over the lake, and the air was fresh, with a slight smell of pine needles. I went out on the porch, and Max immediately ran to the water, splashing everything around. Rocky, as always, followed slowly, stopping at the edge of the terrace and watching his younger friend closely. "Will he ever get tired?" Kate's voice rang out behind me. I turned around and she was standing there in my sweater with her arms around herself against the morning chill. "I don't think so. Max was created for this life." Kate smiled and sat down next to me on the steps of the terrace. "And so are you." I looked at the lake, where the morning sun was barely touching the water. "Yeah. I think I am too. We were silent for a few minutes, listening to the birds singing and the water rushing. Listen, Kate said, I was thinking. What about a small garden near the house? I raised an eyebrow. Do you want to add more bushes for Max? Well, he needs challenges too. I laughed. Let's give it a try. But don't be offended if he digs up everything again. Kate touched my hand. We will survive this. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. A week later, we were already planting the first flowers and small shrubs. Max, as expected, took an active part in the process, more precisely, in digging up what had already been planted. Kate tried to drive him away, but it seemed like he was just playing his own game. I think he thinks he's the chief landscaper, I joked, watching Max proudly stand in the middle of the flower bed, shaking the earth off his paws. Kate just sighed. Okay. Let it be his project. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. We spent the evening of the same day by the fire, setting the table right in the yard. Max was lying at my feet, and Rocky chose a spot a little to the side, enjoying the peace. You know, Kate said, raising her wine glass, I didn't think that living in the country would change me so much. I looked at her. In a good way? The best one. We crossed our eyes, and at that moment I realized that we were really not looking for anything else. Everything we needed was here, all around us. Max sighed in his sleep, and Rocky stretched lazily, as if to confirm this with his calmness. Autumn crept up unnoticed. The trees around the lake were colored golden and red, and the cool mornings brought the smell of campfires and rotting leaves. Max ran around the yard with unbridled energy, chasing falling leaves, and Rocky, as always, watched him from the veranda, clearly preferring to be quiet. One morning, when I returned from a walk with the dogs, Kate met me on the doorstep with a strange smile. We are having guests today, she said, holding the phone in her hands. Who exactly? She tilted her head. Do you remember my sister, Lori? I stopped for a moment. The same Lori who asked us every time why we moved out of the city. Kate nodded, holding back her laughter. She wants to see how we live here. I wonder if it's just curiosity or if she's up to something more. Kate shrugged her shoulders. Perhaps both. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. Lori arrived in the evening, dressed in a down jacket and city shoes that were clearly not meant for walking in the woods. Do you really live here? She said from the doorway, looking around in disbelief. Seriously, I replied, taking her jacket. Max immediately started jumping around her, and Rocky calmly walked over and just nuzzled his nose into her hand, greeting her. Your dog, is he always so calm? He's the one in charge of silence, Kate laughed. Lori stopped at the window and looked out at the lake. It looks like a movie, of course. But aren't you bored here? Not once, Kate replied, sitting down on the couch. I brought a bottle of wine and 3 glasses from the kitchen. Calmness is not boring. You just need to learn to appreciate it. Lori sat down next to her sister, stretching her legs on the warm blanket. Maybe that's exactly what I need, she said quietly, peering into the darkness outside the window. Kate crossed her eyes with me. Maybe. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. A month later, Lori appeared on our doorstep again, but this time wearing a warmer jacket and carrying a coffee pot. Can I stay with you for a few days? I'm kind of tired of the city, she said, blushing slightly. I looked at Kate, who just shook her head. There is a spare room. But keep in mind that you're responsible for Max's walks. It's a deal, Lori smiled. Hashtag hashtag hashtag. This new stage of life brought the unexpected. The house that was once just for the two of us became a place for a family. Lori stayed for a few weeks and then started coming every weekend. And you know what? It was good. Our house came to life even more. Now in the evenings we sat together by the fire, Max got a double supply of cuddles, and Rocky had more quiet places to rest, because Lori always brought soft blankets and made cinnamon tea. I realized that sometimes new stages in life come quietly, together with people who are looking for peace just like we used to. In the evenings, Lori liked to sit on the terrace with a cup of hot tea, wrapped in a blanket. Max always lay at her feet, and Rocky sat a little further away, closer to the front door. One evening I went out to the terrace to take Max inside, but Lori stopped me with a gesture. "Let him stay here. He loves this silence as much as I do." I sat down in the chair next to her. The silence of the lake and the light wind filled the space between us. "You look good," she said, looking at the dark surface of the water. "We live in peace." Apparently, it has an effect. Lori laughed softly. "I would never have thought that you would leave the city and be happy somewhere in the middle of nowhere." I didn't say anything, just watched the moon reflected in the lake. "I didn't expect it either," I finally said. Lori finished her tea and put the cup on the rail. Max looked up and looked at her with interest. "Do you think it would be weird if I found something similar here?" "You mean the house by the lake?" She nodded. "It is not surprising. But you will have to get used to this silence." "I'm getting used to it." Max stood up and barked softly, as if in agreement. And so did he. Lori leaned over to pet him. Maybe this is what I was missing. In the distance, behind the trees, he could hear branches cracking. Rocky looked up, but quickly calmed down, realizing it was just a deer passing by. We sat in silence for a while longer, until Kate peeked out of the door. "Are you going to sit here all night?" "Maybe," Lori replied. Kate sat down on the rail, looking at us with a slight smile. "Lori, if you start wearing flannel shirts and discussing firewood for the winter, I will know that this lake has conquered you." Lori laughed. "The main thing is that I don't start chopping this wood myself." Kate looked at me. "Nick, will you teach her if necessary?" I nodded. "Let him try." Max laid down between us, his head on his paws, and Rocky returned to his place on the stairs. No one else said anything, and the night slowly covered the house without disturbing anything we had created here during this time. Lori started staying on weekends more and more often. One morning I went out to the yard to chop wood and saw her with a small backpack in her hands. "What is this?" I asked, nodding to the backpack. "I think I'll stay a few more days," Lori replied, shaking Max out of the blanket on the terrace. Max immediately jumped up and started jumping around, as if happy to have Lori as part of his routine. Kate came out of the kitchen with a cup of coffee and sat down on the porch. "You have a job. How do you plan to work from here?" Lori waved her hand. "A laptop and a good internet connection are all you need." Kate crossed her eyes with me. "She seems to be serious." I shrugged and started chopping wood. By the evening, Lori had already arranged her things in the guest room. Max followed her around the house, and Rocky just laid down in the living room, accepting her presence as something familiar. After dinner, we sat on the terrace, watching the last rays of the sun glide over the lake. "I was thinking," Lori said, turning to Kate, "maybe we should look at some houses nearby." Kate stopped the ice cream spoon halfway to her mouth. "Wow. That sounds serious." Lori smiled. "I've been here a few weeks and I already feel better than I have in the last few years in the city." "That means something, right?" "I think it's a good sign," I replied, taking a sip of wine. Kate turned to me. "Can you imagine Lori becoming our neighbor? If it means that I can shift my work with Max to someone else, I'm all for it." Lori laughed and raised her glass. "It's a deal." The next weekend, we went to look at several houses nearby. Some of them were old, others were unfinished, but eventually we came across a small wooden house right by the lake, just 10 minutes away. Lori stopped on the threshold and looked at the water for a long time. Have you chosen yet? Kate asked. I think so. Max was running around the yard, and Rocky, as usual, was sitting on the porch, watching everything from the outside. Laurie turned to us with the same smile I saw on Kate's face when we first moved here. It's good here. Kate put her arms around her shoulders. You will soon realize that this is the best solution. I stood a little aside, looking at this new stage that was unfolding right in front of us. And at that moment I knew that this place would become not just our home, it would become a home for the whole family. A few weeks later, Laurie had already moved into her new home. She decorated the living room in light colors, put in a large sofa with blankets, and added rocking chairs to the terrace, which she found at a local market. Max, of course, believed that this house was his second territory. He ran back and forth as if to make sure that Laurie was following all the rules of our forest club. One evening, Kate and I decided to take a walk to Laurie's. Max flew ahead, and Rocky lazily followed, as always, conserving his energy. When we arrived, Laurie was standing by the lake, wrapped in a sweater, throwing a stick into the water. Did Max destroy half your yard again? Kate asked, coming closer. No, this time he was polite. But I suspect it won't be for long, Laurie replied, throwing Max another branch. Max joyfully jumped into the water, making a splash around. You'd think he was a fisherman, not a dog, I laughed. Laurie sat down on the terrace and handed Kate a cup of hot tea. How are you? Aren't you tired of me? Kate shook her head. On the contrary. It would be strange if you weren't here. Laurie shrugged and looked at the lake. I'm still getting used to the silence. But now I feel like I'm in the right place. Max jumped out of the water and shook himself right next to us. That's what the right place means, Kate said, wiping drops of water from her face. Laurie laughed. Max is the main proof that everything is right here. Rocky stopped next to him, lay down on the terrace's plank floor, and sighed heavily. And him too, Laurie added, patting Rocky on the head. We sat there for a long time until evening fell on the lake. Laurie got up and lit the lanterns that hung along the terrace, creating a warm light around the house. Can you stay a little longer? Kate looked at me and nodded. Of course. I leaned against the railing, watching Max circling the yard and Rocky dozing by the door. The water in the lake was calm, and only the moonlight reflected on its surface. This house was the beginning of something new for Laurie, just as it was for us. Laurie disappeared inside the house, leaving us on the terrace. Kate sat comfortably in a chair with her legs tucked under her and handed me a cup of tea. She's fine here, she said, watching Laurie fussing in the kitchen through the window. She got used to it quickly. I think even faster than us. Kate took a sip and laughed. Maybe. She had a plan in place from the first day she stepped foot in the yard. Max was lying on the edge of the terrace, stretched out to his full length, growling softly in his sleep. Rocky, on the other hand, moved almost imperceptibly closer to the fireplace that Laurie had lit before we arrived. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the wooden walls of the house. Laurie returned with a plate of cookies and placed it on the table between us. Yes, I know you're not hungry. But this is for tea. Kate reached for her plate. I would not be so sure. There are no reserves left of you. Laurie sat down in a chair and covered herself with a blanket. Max immediately looked up, stared at the cookies, and crawled closer to the table. Forget it, boy, Laurie said, stroking him behind the ear. Max sighed heavily and put his head in her lap. I think he's blackmailing you, I said. And quite successfully, Kate added, breaking off a piece of cookie and handing it to Max. Laurie looked at me with reproach, but said nothing. The evening continued. An hour later, Kate began to yawn and got up from her chair, pulling on a sweater. It's time to go. Max can no longer compete with Rocky for a place by the fireplace. Laurie came out with us to the yard, where the air was colder than it seemed from inside the house. Will you come here one day and not leave me alone? We leave you Rocky. He never leaves his own. Rocky, hearing his name, lazily raised his head, but remained lying by the fireplace. Kate laughed. You see, he has already decided that this is his new evening home. Laurie waved her hand. And so is Max. I'm sure he'll be here first thing tomorrow morning. Max barked as if to confirm her words. Kate lifted my collar and took my hand. See you tomorrow. I'll have coffee in the morning. Laurie closed the door behind us, leaving the light on the terrace. Kate and I were walking along the path to our house, Max running ahead of us, and Rocky, as always, walking in his leisurely way. The forest was silent, and only the distant barking of dogs from the neighboring yard reminded us that we were not alone. The next morning I woke up before Kate. Max was already sitting by the door, pawing impatiently at the wooden floor. Yes, I understand, I muttered, opening the door for him. He immediately jumped out and ran toward Laurie's house without even looking back. Rocky slowly lifted his head from under the table, but remained lying there, clearly not planning to rush anywhere. When I went out on the porch with a cup of coffee, the morning fog was still hanging over the lake. From a distance, I saw Max already sitting on Laurie's terrace, and she was standing by the window with the same cup in her hands, looking at the water. Kate followed me out, wrapped in a blanket, and sat down on the stairs. Did Max run away again? As soon as I opened the door. I think this is his second home now. Kate laughed softly as she looked at the outline of Laurie outside the house. She's happy here too. Yes. She fit in quickly. Kate nodded, hugging my hand. Do you think she will stay here for long? I looked at the lake, which was calmly spreading out in front of us. I think so. We sat there for a few minutes until Kate got up. I'm going to go make breakfast. Laurie will probably not mind either. I'll call them, I said, getting up from the porch. Rocky stood up and stretched slowly. Let's go, boy. He sighed and followed me, as usual, at his own pace. When I got to Laurie's house, Max had already dragged the branch onto the terrace and was waiting to be played with again. Laurie opened the door, watching him with a smile. How did you live without it before? I don't know. But it's definitely not going to change now. Max ran up to Rocky, who had just come out from behind me, and started licking his face. Laurie stared at the lake with her arms around herself. Kate is cooking breakfast. Want to join her? She nodded and, without taking her eyes off the water, said quietly. You know, I never thought I would be so happy just looking at the lake in the morning. I nodded silently, knowing that I had once said these words to myself. Max was already flying ahead on the path home, and Laurie and Rocky were walking beside me, taking their time. When we came back, the aroma of coffee and fried toast was coming from the kitchen. Kate stood at the stove, and Max sat at the table, waiting for the meal. Laurie followed and sat down by the fireplace, stretching her arms out to the warmth. It looks like this will be a new tradition. Kate smiled and put the plate in front of her. I think so. And I'm not against it. Max lay down by the fireplace, and Rocky sat next to him, closing his eyes. The house was warm, full of familiar voices and silence that no longer seemed empty. That evening the lake was quieter than ever. Laurie stayed for dinner. We sat on the terrace, watching the sun disappear behind the horizon, leaving behind pink reflections on the water. Max was lying on Laura's lap, quietly napping after a long day, and Rocky, as usual, took his place by the door, watching the yard. Kate brought another bottle of wine, and we enjoyed the evening in silence. I don't know how to explain it, Laurie said, lightly stroking Max's ear, but I don't want to go back to the city anymore. Kate looked at me and smiled. It seems that we have created something more than just a house here. Laurie sighed and looked up at the stars that began to appear in the dark sky. You have no idea how much it changed me. I didn't answer anything. The fire in the fireplace was slowly burning down, crackling in the silence. When Laurie got ready to go home, Max went with her, as he did every night. Kate stood next to me, watching them disappear into the darkness along the path. She'll be back tomorrow, Kate said, hugging my hand. As always. We stood on the terrace for a while longer, listening to the silence, and then went inside, leaving the door open in case Max wanted to come back early. Rocky was the last to come in and lay down by the fireplace, sighing as if it were just another ordinary evening and nothing in this world could surprise him. Kate sat down next to me on the couch, resting her head on my shoulder. It's good here.